All right, let's have some fun. All right, terrific. Thank you all for staying, for being here. It's good. We got a lot more fun still to go. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this election and what it's all about. We've been talking a lot about what this election's all about. We already know what it's going to look like on the other side in November 2016, don't we? We know who the candidate is, right? Anybody wondering if it might be Governor O'Malley? I don't think so. We know it's going to be all about Hillary Clinton. And I think we already know what we're going to be talking about if it's Hillary Clinton. You know, God help us, we're going to be talking about lives lost in Benghazi. We're going to be talking about replacing Obamacare. With what? Hillary Care? Remember Hillary Care? Come on. So we're going to be talking about emails. We're going to talking about people sitting in the basement deleting potentially classified emails off of their home servers. So the question is, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to be talking about on our side? Who is our candidate going to be, he or she? What will we be talking about? We will be talking about strong Republican principles. We will be talking about who out of our list of candidates wins the primary. We will be talking about a candidate who has got a strong experience, who is qualified to do the job, who has a heart for America, every single one of them. You know that every one of our candidates is ready to come to bring the experience of applying those principles we were talking about earlier today and turning them into policy and into legislation. Our keynote speaker today, we're so pleased to have him here, so grateful that he's made time for us. He's got one of those records as well. One of those strong Republican records of doing things right. We talk about how Republican principles lift up the entire community. In one term in Wisconsin, Governor Walker turned it around. He took a $3.2 billion deficit, turned it into a $2 billion surplus. One term. He gave the economy a good kick in the you-know-what. 150,000 new jobs. 150,000 people working in Wisconsin who worked before he started. And this is kind of like one of those footnotes that we don't always talk about, but that really is exciting. 25,000 new businesses are in Wisconsin because of the policies that the governor has instituted. That's exciting. That's exciting. And you may or may not have heard, I think you got a little bit of press coverage, thanks to Governor Walker, Wisconsin became the 25th state to sign right to work into law. That's freedom and opportunity for all. Please give a warm, grand state welcome to Governor Scott Walker.
What a great crowd. Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be back. Thanks for the help. Thank you. What an honor to be here today. Thank you. Well, first off, I want to thank your great chair. We have been around the state the last 2 days, but before that, I got a chance to really sit down with Jennifer Horn and get to know her and know her love for this party and more importantly for the state and this country. We were out at the Republican National Committee meeting earlier in the year and Reince Priebus, the RNC chair, actually grew up about 15 miles down the road from me to the one direction. Ironically, Paul Ryan grew up about 15 miles down the road from me the other direction. Must have been something in the water in the 80s. Although actually, funny story about Paul, you get a kick out of this. Paul and I both flipped hamburgers as kids at McDonald's. My first job was washing dishes, and then I moved up to flipping hamburgers at McDonald's. The only difference was I was in Delavan, a small town, he was in Janesville. Honest to God truth, Paul's manager told him he had to flip hamburgers in the back because he didn't have the interpersonal skills to work the front cash register. So you see him kidding about that. It's a true story. But I think about being here in the state and being joined today. My wife, Toinette, First Lady of Wisconsin, is with us as well today. We've got two sons, Matt and Alex. They're 20 and 19. They're both in college. They're both active, actually, amazingly, in college Republicans. In fact, Matthew was just the statewide chair, and he knows you're statewide chair here as well. And so we're thrilled as we go around the country when we see, it's kind of fun to see people who know your kids, not just yourself. So we're real proud of Matt and Alex, and they're probably going to make a point. they twisted our arms to figure out a way to maybe take part of the semester off next year and next fall and come to New Hampshire and come around the country and talk to young people like themselves. Because we're real proud of the fact that in our state, in the last election, when I was the #1 target in the country, at least one of the network exit polls showed that amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, we went 49 to 48%. So how about that? We got the message out. And I want to tell you how much I appreciate all of you, not just being here today, but many of you, as I look around this room, helped us out over the last couple of years. People forget this, but back in 2010, I was target #1 at that point in the recall election. And so many people across this country reached out here in New Hampshire and elsewhere and made a $20 or $25 donation, or a lot of people actually literally at home reached out and went online and made phone calls for us. Most importantly for tonight and I, a lot of people said they prayed for us, and I got to tell you, in the height of all those protests and the recall for us and our family, even with 100,000 protesters, even with the death threats and all the other nonsense, the folks who reached out and lent their support like that meant the world to us. So thank you to all of you here who did that along the way. Back 4 years ago, when we had all the protests, I remember Time magazine had a headline that said, "Dead Men Walking." They didn't think I was going to get past the recall, let alone be reelected. And we knew that our reforms would work. We just needed enough time to prove it. In fact, I remember our polls were so bad about this point in the spring of 2011 that they thought, there was no way we could win. And yet, two things happened. By that fall, when our kids and all the other kids went to public schools, went back to school, the schools that had used our reforms found that their schools were the same or better. And then in December, when property tax bills came out, and after a dozen years of property taxes going way up, property taxes in our state actually went down. Like I'm proud to say today, in my state, property taxes are lower today than they were 4 years ago when I started. How about that for a turnaround, right? And we knew that would make a difference. And sure enough, when people saw, they didn't have to see the TV ads that were attacking us starting in March of 2011. They didn't have to believe all the protesters that came in from around the country. When they could see for themselves that the reforms were working, the tide started to change. And by June of 2012, we won that election. In June of that year, with a higher percentage of the vote, with more actual votes cast than we had in November of 2010, 2 years earlier. That shows the results matter, right? The reason I tell you that is not just for background. The reason I tell you that is because as I look at America today, I have a lot of the same worries that Tonette and I had when we first thought about running for governor. Many years ago, in 2009, we sat down and talked about, we thought about, we ultimately prayed about getting the race for governor. And we knew it would be tough, because in our state, we haven't carried the state for Republicans since 1984. When I was in high school and I still had a full head of hair, so it's a long time ago. But when I think back to that, it was back to those days, early in 2009, we knew it would be tough in our state to run and win. But we knew we had to, because we were worried for our sons who were then in high school that they were going to grow up in a state, well, that wasn't as great as the state we grew up in. And I got to tell you, as a parent, that's just unacceptable. And so we got in that election, we won that battle. I got to tell you, it was all the better, because when we faced all the grief that we did 4 years ago at this time, it was worth it, because if it had just been about a title or a position, we might have backed down. But because we knew it was about our sons, Matt and Alex, and all the other sons and daughters like them and those yet to be born, we knew it was worth standing up and fighting for. We knew that even though those groups, it's like the book that was held up here a moment ago, the title of that book is called Unintimidated, because we knew the tactics they were using in our state are like the tactics they use around the country. They seek to intimidate. Instead of intimidating us, it reminded us exactly who elected us and the job they elected us to do. And from that point forward, we never lost focus of what we were intended to do, and that's what we need more of in America today. You see, today, as much as I'm proud, as Jennifer talked about, of the changes, the transformational changes we made in our state, I'm proud of the fact that for my sons and their generation, I can say today that not only is the state better than it was 4 years before, it's as good or better than it was when I was growing up. And that was my goal, because I wanted my kids to grow up in a better place than we did. I got to tell you again, as a parent today, I'm worried. I'm worried for our country. I'm worried about my sons and your sons and daughters, my nieces and your nieces and nephews and grandsons and granddaughters. I'm worried that we're headed down that same path that worried me years ago in my own state. But I'm an optimist. So I'm not just worried, I have optimism that if we can put the kind of leadership in place in this country that we have done in my state and many of my neighboring states, where common sense leaders stood up 4 years ago and said, we're going to change things, we're going to make them better, we're going to lead in a way that's common sense, Republican, conservative principles, we're going to enact those in a way that make our states better, and we have, I believe we can do the same thing in America. Let me give you 3 examples. When I look at this country, I think there's a clear contrast out there, particularly when it comes to growth. You listen to the President of the United States, particularly when he gave his State of the Union address, and he talked a lot. I tried to listen to him to see, as an American first, I hope for the best. But I hear a president, and I hear many of his allies, like Hillary Clinton and others out there, who I think believe that you grow the economy in Washington. Think about last year, there was a report that showed that 6 of the top 10 wealthiest counties in America aren't in New York, or California, or Florida, or Texas. You know where they're at? In and around Washington. In and around Washington. That says to me, they think you grow the economy in Washington. I believe in America, we believe, the vast majority of the rest of us, from outside of Washington, which, by the way, I call 68 square miles surrounded by reality. That's what Washington is. The rest of us who live in reality understand we grow the economy in cities and towns and villages all across this great country. That people create jobs, not the government. It's about time we have leaders that will help the people of this country grow their jobs. It's why I'm proud of the fact that we've lowered the burden in our state. And most of the states that have been successful in lowering unemployment and raising employment have done so by lowering the burden of hardworking taxpayers. Now, sometimes people in my state who don't always agree with me question why my obsession with lowering taxes. We've lowered them $2 billion on individuals, on employers, and on property in our state. And they say, why are you so obsessed with lowering the tax burden? I said, I have a simple way of explaining this. Tonette knows this. On February 6th last month, Tonette and I celebrated our 22nd wedding anniversary. You're probably amazed that she hung with me that long, but particularly after the last 4 years. But I made a critical mistake not long after we were married. I went to Kohl's department stores and I bought something at the price it was marked at. Right? So now I've been trained well. I know after many years of practice that if I'm going to go buy a shirt, I go to that rack that says it was $29.99 and now it's $19.99. And then I get the Sunday insert out with a little scratch off and I take it up to the cash register along with my Kohl's credit card. And then I take the mailer that we get because we shop there a lot and sometimes it's 15 or 20%, and if we're really lucky, it's 30%, right, hon? We're really lucky, we get the 30% off. And then we pull out the Kohl's cash and we lay it on the counter. And next thing you know, they're paying me to buy that shirt, right? Right? A little aside on this, I actually was wearing a sweater yesterday. I didn't want to wear the same color for 2 days, so I actually stopped by Kohl's and bought this sweater. In the rack, we're at 70% off, and we paid $1 for it with our Kohl's cash along the way, so living the high life. But I say, so how does a company like Kohl's make money? They make it off of volume, right? They make it off volume. They can charge $29.99 for that shirt, and a few people would buy it, or they can lower the price, broaden the volume, and next thing you know, all of us are buying things at a place like that. I call that the Kohl's curve, because you know what? That's like your money. It's the taxpayers' money. I could charge you a higher rate, a few of you could afford it, or I could lower the rates, broaden the base, have more people participate in the economy, and that's the way you build the economy going forward, right? This growth, which we need to do more of, and that means doing things like repealing Obamacare and actually having an energy policy and doing all the things that fuel this economy going forward. But in addition to growth, there's reform. And think about the contrast here. You know, this president and his allies tend to measure success in government by how many people are dependent on the government, by how many people are Medicaid and food stamps and unemployment. We should measure success by just the opposite, by how many people are no longer dependent on the government, right? understand that true freedom and prosperity doesn't come from the mighty hand of the government. It comes from empowering people to live their own lives and control their own destinies to the dignity that's born of work. Think about it. If you don't remember anything else, I love pointing this out. When I was a kid growing up in that small town of Delavan, I don't ever remember one of my classmates saying to me, "Hey, Scott, someday when we grow up, I want to become dependent in the government," right? Nobody signed my yearbook, "Dear Scott, good luck becoming dependent in the government." And yet somehow that's acceptable in Washington. And I got to tell you, over the years, I've met some amazing people who've come here from other places around the world. Some really amazing people. And I wish my kids would hear their stories more often, because to a person, the ones that I have met who've been successful small business owners today are people who tell me the reason they came here was not to become dependent in the government. The reason they came to America was because it was one of the last places left in the world where it doesn't matter what class you were born into. It doesn't matter what your parents did for a living. In America, you can be and do anything you want. The opportunity is equal to all of us, but the outcome should be up to each and every one of us. I got to tell you, that's something I learned a long time ago. You know, my father was a preacher. My mom was a secretary part-time, raised my brother and I. My grandparents on one side were farmers, where my mom didn't have indoor plumbing until she went off to junior high. My grandfather, my grandpa Walker, my dad's side, was a machinist for 40 years. From all my parents and grandparents, I didn't inherit fame or fortune. What I got was something more important. I got the belief that in America, if you work hard and you play by the rules, you should be able to do or be anything you want. That has slipped away, and we need to restore that back again in America. And so I think one of the best ways we reform this federal government is by taking power out of Washington and sending it back to the states. You send it back in big areas, right? That's the way we get government that's more efficient and more effective and ultimately more accountable to the hardworking taxpayers. And then the last thing I tell you, beyond just growth and reform, something that's heavy on my heart these days is safety. Safety. You know, I don't call it national security, I call it safety. Because when you see those images of the Jordanian who was burned alive in a cage, when you see the beheadings of the Christians from Egypt or others from around the world, I got to tell you, that makes me worried, not just for myself and my country, it makes me worried for my children and your children, and anyone else who would ever dare to travel around this world. And that's not right. And that's not right. And what frustrates me is we've got a president who draws a line in the sand and somehow allows people to cross it. A president who calls ISIS the JV squad, who calls Yemen a success story, who calls Iran a place we can do business with, whose former Secretary of State gave Russia a reset button. A reset button. Think about that. We need a commander-in-chief in this country who stands up and once and for all says, our biggest threat is radical Islamic terrorism, and we will do whatever it takes to lead it down the world. We need a president who will do whatever it takes, who understands that we have an ally in Israel and we should start acting like it. Who understands that radical Islamic terrorism is like a virus, and if you don't take it out entirely, it's like a virus in your computer. It will keep coming back. And I don't know about all of you, but I'd rather take the fight to them than wait till it comes to us on American soil. And so I'm worried about where this country's headed. And I'm worried about our position in the world. But I am an optimist. And I believe, just as we have in the past, we will rise up to this occasion again. You see, years ago, I mentioned I grew up in a small town. Our family didn't have a lot of money. And so, even though I loved history, I loved our founders, I thought of them like superheroes, bigger than life. I never had a chance to go to Washington or Philadelphia or New York or anywhere else. And so, not long after I was elected governor in the fall of 2011, Tonette and I got a chance to go to Philadelphia, and we were there for a governor's conference, and we got up early in the morning, and I wanted to go over to Independence Hall. We went by the Liberty Bell, and we went into Independence Hall, and if you've ever been there, you know it's not very big. And I got in there as someone who thought of our founders it's bigger than life. I thought to myself, man, I'm going to be blown away. And I got up there early in the morning, and I looked, as we looked at the tables, the desks, and the chairs, particularly the chair up in the front where Washington sat with the half-rising sun, and I thought to myself, these are just like the chairs and desks we sit in today. They're just a little older. And it dawned on me. These were ordinary people. These were ordinary people who did something quite extraordinary. These are people who didn't just risk their political careers. These are people who didn't just risk their business ventures. These were patriots who risked their lives for the freedoms we all do today. Moments like that are amazing to me because what they do is restore into me the belief in the American spirit, because it reminds me that not just in those moments, but all throughout our history, in moments of crisis, be it economic or fiscal, be it military or spiritual, what has made America exceptional, what has made us arguably the greatest country in the history of the world, has been in moments of crisis like that, there have been men and women of courage who've been willing to stand up and think more about the future of their children and their grandchildren than they thought about their own political futures. I tell you here today, let this be one of those moments in history. Let this be a time in history where we can look back and tell future generations what we did to make America great again. Thank you for the chance to come on out. God bless you. We'll be back many more times today.
I think we're going to start out with me making a quick announcement, something nobody else knows. We haven't told anybody else this. Our final, not our final, but the next announcement that we're going to make for the First Nation Primary Summit, we were talking about it earlier, down in Nashua, April 17th and 18th. We want to see you there. Governor Walker will be joining us for that. Okay, we've got some folks with the microphones out in the audience. Jim has his hand up right here. Allie, over on this side.
You hear me? I guess you can. All right, Board of Directors of the Gun Owners of New Hampshire have asked me to give you this hat. Got a first-rate record on the Second Amendment. We hope you'll wear the hat often and keep up the good work. I said, it looks great. President of the New Hampshire State Council of Vietnam Veterans, so I follow military developments and deployments fairly closely. I understand that you are, and based on the comments you made, you were more than a little receptive to the idea that we might be going back into the Middle East. I'm wondering what your objective in the Middle East would be, what your grand strategy, what the Walker administration's grand strategy to achieve that objective would be, and how it's going to differ from the last two presidents, in my opinion, counterproductive efforts.
Well, first off, thank you for your service. Tip of the hat for that. Appreciate your service. We can never say it enough, but particularly for Vietnam veterans, particularly appreciate that. And I think you can appreciate this as much as anyone else here. No matter who the Commander-in-Chief is in the future, anytime the Commander-in-Chief makes a decision that will ultimately involve in American men or women being called into harm's way, we need to have a clear mission and we need to follow through on that mission. Now with the caveat here, I want to be clear because I don't want to get ahead of the game, but should we choose to get in this race, and we're obviously feeling pretty strong about reactions like we heard here today and others across the country, and should we be blessed with the opportunity to earn the votes of people not only here in New Hampshire but around the country, one of the things I would take most seriously is not just being president, but being Commander-in-Chief. Because I got to tell you, I'm not a big bracelet person, but I've got 3 bracelets on my arm that come from Gold Star families whose funerals I've gone for their, either as governor or before, for their sons. And as I think about a question like that, to me, I think about the fact that personally, I don't want to ever go to a funeral like that again. But I also know for those sons and for the sons and daughters that they represent across this country, I also want to make sure that I can look those families in the eye and say their son or other son and daughters like them did not die in vain, and that we will live up to the mighty goals that caused them and that led them into serving our country in the first place. And so to me, I look at what I believe is not well defined by some in our political discourse today, and that is, I think our clearest threat right now is radical Islamic terrorism. I see it embodied right now in Syria and Libya, but growing elsewhere around the world. And I just believe fundamentally when you listen to the leaders of organizations like ISIS and others like them, it is clear what their intent is. It's not to stay in the Middle East. It is eventually to come back to American soil and to cause harm against Americans, because that's their identified threat there. And so my belief is that just like a virus in a computer, that we need to go and to whatever length is required to make sure that we eradicate radical Islamic terrorism where it's at before it washes up. I don't believe that means you automatically go with ground troops, although unlike this president, I will not signal to our enemies how far we will go. I think that's a problem. Even Leon Panetta, his former Secretary of Defense, has said that's a mistake because they'll just wait you out. But I think we should not be doing it alone. I think first and foremost, you've got to consult with the Congress. You need to listen to those who advise you, not just the Joint Chiefs, but the generals in the field, to get a real feel for what's going on, as well as your intelligence community. I think we need to branch out and reaffirm our allies, as I mentioned, restating Israel as a prime ally, but also working with the United Kingdom, with Germany, with Japan, with Australia, with Canada, with others out there. And then I believe increasingly, in light of what's happened in the last 6 or 7 months, I believe there are partners in the coalition we can draw on from the Arab world, like Jordan, like Egypt, because of what's happened to their own citizens out there, and have a true coalition force. And then we've got to take action depending on where appropriately designed by our military and our coalition forces. So I'm not proposing to engage full-scale boots on the ground, but I'm not taking that off the table, because I think we need to be clear what our objective is, and our objective has to be a generational act to make sure that we eradicate radical Islamic terrorism before it comes to our shore.
Hello? Oh, yes, I guess it's on. Okay, you had mentioned earlier about taking power away from the federal government and moving it to the states. So I'm interested in removing power from the federal government and actually giving it to parents and people who pay taxes to their local schools. So I have a two-part question on education. Can you please tell us what you've done in your state to eradicate Common Core that is causing havoc in our schools right now? That's the first question. And then the second question has to do with the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, because Jeb Bush was in New Hampshire last night and says he wants to reauthorize a failed program. So I can't figure that out. But could you tell us what your thoughts are on H.R. 5, and would you reauthorize something that we all know is a failure?
And when I talk about those three buckets, growth, reform, and safety, in the reform category, I believe we need to move whole-scale portions of the federal government back to the states, or in some cases back to the local governments, like education, which are ultimately put those levels of government are more accountable to everyday taxpayers. Not every level of government obviously is perfect, but it gets you closer. So in areas like Medicaid and transportation, to me, I'd move those to the states. In areas like transportation, I'd be predisposed to send it all the way back to the school. And the example I give to people, not just at events like this, is I tell people, take $1 out of your purse or your wallet and ask yourself, where would you better have that spent? Is it better spent sending it to Washington, where they skim all this money off the top and put it into bureaucracy, and then your school eventually gets pennies on the dollar back? Or is it better spent keeping that dollar in your school in the first place, where your school board members, your teachers, your parents, and others who are actively involved in those schools can make a difference? That's something I say not just in answer to you too. Today, I've said it many times before, I think we're better off in that regard. So that answers your other part to me in terms of No Child Left Behind or any of the other things like that. I'd rather just have the money and the authority go back to the local level. I think we are better off in that regard, better off sending those guys. on the other part of schools, I'm all for high standards. I'm pleased to say that after 4 years of our reforms, even though the left said that it was going to just annihilate public education in our state, which was kind of interesting for me because Tonette and I had 2 sons in public schools at that time. Like, why would I want to do that to my kids? But the reality is that because of our reforms that put the power back in the hands of the taxpayers and the people they duly elect to run our school boards, because of what we've done, we have no seniority, we have no tenure, we can hire and fire based on merit, we can pay based on performance. That means our schools can put the best and the brightest in our classrooms, and the good news is, our scores are better. ACT scores are second best in the country, graduation rates are up, all the indicators are positive out there. So I like that, but I believe in high standards set at the local level. I don't want someone from outside of my state or increasingly outside of my community telling me what high standards are. I want those to be set by people at the local level. In our state, it's weird, we have a separate Department of Public Instruction which is independently elected. So unlike many governors, I don't have a cabinet position to say to the Secretary of Education, do this. So by statute, I have to make those changes in the budget. The budget I present on February 3rd removes any legal requirement from any school district in my state to have to abide by Common Core, and it removes all funding for the Smarter Balance Test, which is tied to the Common Core. See, she asked what I do with the lights. It's the visor on this. It's perfect. Which, by the way, I should have pointed out looking at this hat. I'm proud to say that I signed the law that made Wisconsin the 49th state in the country to have shell carry, open or concealed carry, as well as castle doctrine. So I appreciate that.
Governor Walker, I want to...
Shut it out. I'll repeat it for you then.
Okay. I want to thank you personally for what you did for right to work in Wisconsin. I would hope that the governors in this state, the last 3 out of the 4, do not understand it's a liberty issue. I want to just start by thanking you for that. My question is, I see one of the biggest threats to this country to be the debt and the overreach of the federal government. And they would not be able to enact all of their policies if we didn't have a federal income tax, because as long as they can take our money, there's nothing we can do about it. And I was wondering your stance on abolishing the federal income tax. Because as long as they have it, they've got us behind the 8 ball.
Well, I haven't proposed that, although it sounds pretty tempting right now, particularly in this state. I'd love that. Certainly, I think lower rates, we talked about that, we've looked at that, and as we, right now not being a declared candidate, but should I get in this race, that's something we'll take on in that growth category out there. I will say, as I mentioned before, though, 2 things. One, I think putting more money back in the hands of the hardworking taxpayers, which is your money to begin with, is a much better way to grow the economy than through government so-called stimulus, which has a much lower rate of return than it does if you and job creators and others have that money out there. But per your larger point, not just about taxes, but about the size and scope of the federal government. To me, it's part of the reason why not just on education, but to me on a whole series of workforce investment dollars, transportation dollars, Medicaid and other social service programs. Part of the challenge that we have controlling our government, both in terms of its size and for the limited part that's left that should be under the government, to me, for example, defense. We don't do a very good job with the Department of Defense getting them the resources they need to protect us safely, and yet we spend all this money in all these other areas. I would either get rid of major portions of it or send the vast majority of it back to state, local governments, and ultimately to the taxpayers. Because I think the closer you get to the people, the more you can hold your government accountable. You all live it right here.
Terrific. The governor wants to be able to have time to shake hands and say hi to all of you, so I think that's going to be our last question. I want to strongly encourage you all to come back to the next grassroots training, even though Governor Walker probably won't be at that one. We need you to keep coming back all through the year. And just one more time, let me encourage you to go to fitn.gop and get registered for that First in the Nation Summit. It's going to be a blast. Governor, thank you so much for coming to New York.